In the heart of West Africa, where the Niger River has carried the dreams and aspirations of empires for over a millennium, a decision was made on Thursday that will reverberate across the continent and beyond. Mali's transitional parliament unanimously approved legislation granting General Assimi Goïta an unelected presidential mandate that can be renewed as many times as necessary without elections. This isn't merely another political maneuver in a distant African capital. This is a moment that crystallizes the fundamental tension between authentic African sovereignty and the perennial struggle for genuine democratic governance that has defined our continent since independence. For those who have followed African politics with the nuanced understanding it deserves, Mali's current trajectory presents us with a profound paradox. Here stands a nation that has expelled French forces, challenged Western military presence, and asserted its right to choose its own security partners, actions that would have made Kwame Nkrumah himself proud. Yet simultaneously, we witness the consolidation of military power that sidesteps the very democratic processes that could legitimize such sovereignty in the eyes of the Malian people themselves. This is not the binary narrative that Western media often presents, where African leaders are either compliant democrats or despotic strongmen. This is the complex reality of a continent navigating between authentic self-determination and the fundamental question of who speaks for the African people. The 41-year-old Goïta, who has held presidential power since the military intervention of August 2020, now finds himself at the center of a continental conversation about leadership, legitimacy, and the very nature of African political evolution. His government's resistance to international pressure for elections, coupled with decisive actions against neocolonial military arrangements, forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about sovereignty, representation, and the path forward for African nations caught between external manipulation and internal transformation. To understand the significance of Thursday's parliamentary decision, we must first appreciate the rich historical context that has shaped Mali's political consciousness. This is not merely a contemporary story of military coups and political transitions. This is the latest chapter in a narrative that stretches back to the medieval empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, when African kingdoms controlled trans-Saharan trade routes and Timbuktu stood as a beacon of learning that illuminated the world. The Mali of today emerged from French colonial rule in 1960 under the leadership of Modibo Keïta, a Pan-Africanist who understood that true independence required more than ceremonial flag-raising. Keïta's vision aligned with the continental awakening led by figures like Nkrumah in Ghana, Lumumba in Congo, and later Sankara in Burkina Faso, leaders who recognized that political independence without economic sovereignty was merely a more sophisticated form of colonialism. However, like so many of his contemporaries, Keïta's transformative agenda was cut short by military intervention in 1968, beginning a cycle of political instability that would plague Mali for decades. The subsequent decades witnessed Mali's integration into the neocolonial economic architecture that has characterized Franco-African relations since the 1960s. The CFA franc, imposed monetary policies, and preferential trade agreements created a dependency relationship that limited Mali's strategic autonomy while ensuring continued French influence over its economic trajectory. This arrangement, replicated across Francophone Africa, represented the sophistication of modern imperialism, maintaining control through economic levers rather than direct political administration. The democratic transition of the 1990s, which brought Alpha Oumar Konaré to power, represented a genuine attempt to establish constitutional governance while navigating the complex relationship with former colonial powers. Konaré's leadership demonstrated that African democracy could flourish when leaders remained accountable to their people rather than external patrons. However, the limitations of this democratic experiment became apparent during the subsequent presidency of Amadou Toumani Touré, whose government struggled with corruption, regional instability, and the growing influence of armed groups in northern Mali. The 2012 crisis that brought down Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta's government exposed the fundamental contradictions of Mali's position within the broader neocolonial framework. Despite hosting French military bases and maintaining close ties with Paris, Mali found itself unable to effectively address the security challenges in its northern regions. The intervention of French forces through Operation Serval, while temporarily stabilizing the situation, reinforced Mali's dependence on external military support, a dependency that many Malians increasingly viewed as incompatible with genuine sovereignty. This historical trajectory helps explain why Goïta's rise to power in 2020 resonated with significant segments of Malian society. The young colonel represented a break from the established political class that had presided over decades of limited sovereignty and persistent insecurity. His government's subsequent decisions to expel French forces, challenge the presence of UN peacekeepers, and explore alternative security partnerships reflected a broader continental shift towards strategic autonomy that echoes the anti-colonial movements of the 1960s. The unanimous approval of legislation extending Goïta's mandate represents a critical juncture in Mali's political evolution that demands careful analysis beyond superficial categorizations. This decision occurs within a context where traditional Western democratic models are increasingly questioned by African societies seeking authentic forms of governance that reflect their historical experiences and contemporary challenges. Goïta's government has implemented policies that demonstrate genuine commitment to Malian sovereignty in ways that previous civilian administrations failed to achieve. The expulsion of French forces from Mali, regardless of one's perspective on the methods employed, represents a fundamental assertion of national sovereignty that resonates throughout Francophone Africa. For decades, the presence of French military bases on African soil symbolized the continuation of colonial relationships through military means. By challenging this arrangement, Mali's current leadership has inspired similar movements across the Sahel region, from Niger to Burkina Faso, creating a regional momentum toward strategic autonomy. The economic dimensions of this sovereignty assertion are equally significant. Mali's exploration of alternative monetary arrangements, including discussions about leaving the CFA franc zone, addresses one of the most fundamental aspects of neocolonial control. The CFA franc, with its fixed exchange rate to the euro and requirement that member countries deposit 50% of their foreign reserves with the French treasury, represents a monetary colonialism that has limited African economic sovereignty for over 6 decades. Any serious discussion of African independence must grapple with these structural constraints on monetary policy and economic planning. However, the extension of Goïta's mandate without elections raises profound questions about the relationship between sovereignty and democratic legitimacy. The tension here is not merely procedural, it touches the heart of how African societies define legitimate governance in the 21st century. While Western democratic models often serve as benchmarks for political legitimacy, African political traditions offer alternative frameworks for understanding authority, representation, and accountability that predate colonial impositions. The unanimous vote in Mali's transitional parliament, while criticized by international observers as undemocratic, must be understood within the context of how this body was constituted and whom it represents. The transitional government has argued that the security challenges facing Mali require stable leadership that can implement long-term strategies without the disruption of electoral cycles. This argument echoes similar justifications made by transformative African leaders throughout history, from Nkrumah's one-party state to Sankara's revolutionary government in Burkina Faso. Yet the critical question remains whether Goïta's extended mandate serves the interests of the Malian people or merely consolidates military power under the guise of sovereignty. This distinction is crucial because genuine African sovereignty must be rooted in the will and welfare of African peoples, not in the ambitions of individual leaders or military institutions. The test of any sovereignty movement lies not in its rhetoric about independence, but in its delivery of security, prosperity, and dignity to the populations it claims to serve. The regional implications of Mali's decision extend far beyond its borders, influencing political dynamics across the Sahel and West Africa. The success or failure of Mali's sovereignty experiment will impact similar movements in Niger, Burkina Faso, and other nations seeking to redefine their relationships with former colonial powers. If Goïta's government can deliver tangible improvements in security, economic development, and social services, it may provide a model for other African nations seeking alternatives to neocolonial arrangements. Conversely, if the extended mandate leads to increased authoritarianism, economic stagnation, or social instability, it may discredit sovereignty movements across the continent and provide justification for continued external intervention in African affairs. The stakes of this political experiment extend far beyond Mali's borders, influencing the broader trajectory of African political development in the 21st century. The decision to extend Goïta's mandate without elections sends shockwaves through the complex web of African regional organizations, continental institutions, and international partnerships that have shaped the continent's political landscape for decades. This move occurs at a moment when African nations are increasingly asserting their right to chart independent courses in foreign policy, economic partnerships, and security arrangements, a trend that challenges the post-colonial international order. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, which has served as both a vehicle for regional integration and a mechanism for external influence, finds itself confronting a fundamental challenge to its authority. ECOWAS sanctions against Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have proven largely ineffective in reversing military governments or compelling democratic transitions. Instead, these sanctions have driven the three nations to form the Alliance of Sahel States, creating an alternative regional framework that explicitly challenges ECOWAS's approach to governance and sovereignty. This regional realignment reflects broader shifts in African geopolitics that extend far beyond West Africa. The African Union's response to Mali's decision will test the continental organization's commitment to both democratic governance and respect for national sovereignty. The AU's previous positions on unconstitutional changes of government have emphasized the importance of electoral legitimacy, yet the organization has also recognized the need for African solutions to African problems. The challenge facing continental institutions is how to balance support for democratic principles with recognition of the legitimate sovereignty concerns raised by Mali's government. The AU's Peace and Security Council must navigate between its foundational commitments to constitutional governance and its recognition that external interference in African affairs often undermines both democracy and sovereignty. This balancing act requires sophisticated diplomatic engagement that moves beyond rigid adherence to procedural democracy toward substantive assessment of whether governments serve their people's interests. The broader implications for African international relations are equally significant. Mali's decision occurs within the context of a global realignment where traditional Western powers face increasing challenges from emerging economies and alternative international frameworks. China's Belt and Road Initiative, Russia's expanding presence in Africa, and the growing influence of Gulf states create new opportunities for African nations to diversify their international partnerships. Mali's exploration of security partnerships with Russia through the Wagner Group, regardless of one's assessment of this relationship, represents a fundamental challenge to the monopoly that Western nations have maintained over African security arrangements since independence. This diversification of security partnerships reflects a broader continental trend towards strategic autonomy that includes everything from military cooperation to economic partnerships. The response of Western nations to Mali's decision will significantly influence the trajectory of African international relations. If external powers respond with increased sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or threats of intervention, they risk validating the sovereignty narrative that drives many African governments toward alternative partnerships. Conversely, if Western nations can demonstrate genuine respect for African sovereignty while maintaining support for democratic governance, they may preserve constructive relationships with African nations seeking to balance independence with international cooperation. The youth demographic across Africa, which represents the continent's largest political constituency, will play a crucial role in determining the success or failure of Mali's sovereignty experiment. Young Africans have demonstrated their commitment to both democratic participation and genuine independence through movements like the Arab Spring, EndSARS in Nigeria, and similar popular uprisings across the continent. Their assessment of whether Goïta's government delivers meaningful improvements in employment, education, and social services will ultimately determine the legitimacy of extended military rule. The debate surrounding Mali's political transformation cannot be fully understood without examining the cultural and traditional dimensions of governance that continue to influence African political consciousness. Mali's rich heritage of traditional kingdoms, Islamic scholarship, and indigenous governance systems provides alternative frameworks for understanding authority and legitimacy that challenge Western-centric definitions of democratic governance. The historical kingdoms of Mali, with their sophisticated systems of consultation, representation, and accountability, offer models of African governance that predate colonial impositions. These traditional systems, while not directly replicable in modern nation-states, provide cultural foundations for understanding how African societies have historically organized political authority. The concept of consensus building, respect for elders, and collective decision-making that characterize these systems continues to influence how many Africans understand legitimate governance. The Islamic intellectual tradition, particularly strong in Mali, with its historic centers of learning in Timbuktu and Djenné, contributes another dimension to discussions of political authority and social organization. Islamic principles of consultation, shura, justice, ADL, and collective welfare, maslaha, provide religious and philosophical frameworks for evaluating political leadership that may differ from secular Western democratic theories. Understanding how these cultural resources influence popular assessments of political legitimacy is crucial for comprehending the full context of Mali's current political transformation. The generational divide in African societies adds another layer of complexity to discussions of governance and sovereignty. Older generations, who experienced the promise and disappointment of independence movements, may have different expectations of political leadership than younger generations who have known only the limitations of neocolonial arrangements. This generational perspective influences how different segments of society evaluate the trade-offs between democratic procedures and sovereign assertion. The role of women in African political traditions, often marginalized in colonial and post-colonial governance structures, provides another lens through which to examine contemporary political developments. Traditional African societies often recognize significant roles for women in political decision-making, economic management, and social organization. The extent to which contemporary sovereignty movements incorporate these traditional roles and perspectives will influence their legitimacy and effectiveness. As we approach the conclusion of this analysis, we must confront the fundamental question that underlies Mali's political transformation. What constitutes legitimate governance in 21st century Africa? The answer to this question cannot be divorced from the broader struggle for African sovereignty that has defined the continent's political development since independence. The extension of Goïta's mandate represents both an opportunity and a challenge for African political development. The opportunity lies in the potential for Mali to demonstrate that African nations can chart independent courses in international relations, economic policy, and security arrangements without sacrificing the welfare of their people. If Mali's government can deliver improved security, economic development, and social services while maintaining its sovereignty, it may provide a model for other African nations seeking alternatives to neocolonial arrangements. The challenge lies in ensuring that sovereignty serves the interests of the Malian people, rather than merely consolidating military power. This requires transparent governance, accountability mechanisms, and genuine consultation with civil society organizations, traditional authorities, and the broader population. The test of any sovereignty movement lies not in its rhetoric about independence, but in its delivery of tangible benefits to the populations it claims to serve. The international community's response to Mali's decision will significantly influence the trajectory of African political development. Constructive engagement that respects African sovereignty while supporting democratic governance offers the best path forward for maintaining productive relationships between African nations and their international partners. This requires moving beyond rigid adherence to procedural democracy toward substantive assessment of whether governments serve their people's interests. The youth of Africa, who represent the continent's demographic majority and political future, will ultimately determine the success or failure of sovereignty movements across the continent. Their assessment of whether these movements deliver meaningful improvements in employment, education, healthcare, and social services will shape the legitimacy of contemporary African governments. Supporting youth engagement in political processes, economic development, and social transformation remains crucial for any sustainable political system. The broader Pan-African movement, which inspired the independence struggles of the 1960s and continues to influence contemporary African politics, provides a framework for understanding Mali's transformation within the context of continental development. The success of any individual nation's sovereignty experiment depends partly on broader continental integration, mutual support among African nations, and collective resistance to external interference in African affairs. As we witness this critical moment in Mali's political evolution, we must remember that the struggle for African sovereignty is not merely about individual nations asserting their independence. It is about the fundamental right of African peoples to determine their own futures, choose their own leaders, and chart their own paths toward prosperity and dignity. This struggle requires both courage to challenge unjust arrangements and wisdom to build sustainable alternatives that serve the interests of current and future generations. The decision made in Mali's transitional parliament on Thursday represents one chapter in this ongoing struggle. Whether this chapter contributes to the broader narrative of African liberation or becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power depends on the choices made by Mali's leaders, the engagement of its people, and the support of the broader African community. We must continue to follow these developments with the critical analysis they deserve, supporting genuine sovereignty movements while holding all African leaders accountable to the highest standards of service to their people. The future of African political development depends on our ability to distinguish between authentic expressions of sovereignty and mere consolidations of power, between leaders who serve their people and those who serve only themselves. For those who believe in the potential of African peoples to govern themselves with wisdom, justice, and dignity, Mali's transformation represents both a test and an opportunity. Let us engage with this moment with the sophistication it deserves, supporting the legitimate aspirations of African peoples while maintaining our commitment to governance that serves the common good. If you found this analysis valuable for understanding the complexities of African sovereignty and political transformation, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel, and ringing the notification bell to stay updated on our coverage of African political developments. Your engagement helps us continue providing the nuanced analysis that African affairs deserve, moving beyond superficial headlines to explore the deeper currents shaping our continent's future. Share this video with others who are interested in understanding African politics beyond the simplistic narratives often presented in mainstream media. Together, we can build a community of informed observers who appreciate the complexity of African political development and support the legitimate aspirations of African peoples for sovereignty, dignity, and prosperity. The struggle for African sovereignty continues, and your engagement in these conversations contributes to the broader movement for African self-determination. Subscribe, like, share, and let us continue this crucial conversation about the future of our continent.